Hello, class. We are going to go ahead and look at our chapter 2 for this afternoon or evening or morning, whenever you're taking the time out to check out your chapter 2 for psychology, general psychology. So we're going to look at, in chapter 2, neuroscience and the biological foundations of human beings and what that looks like. So let's take some time out to look at that. So when we're looking at neuroscience and we're looking at biological foundations, we are looking at our genetic heritage, what we receive from our parents, what we receive from biological makeups, and also our environmental influences. So for your exam, I would like for you to focus on being able to define behavioral genetics. So when we're looking at behavioral genetics and defining that, we're studying how our genetic makeup and our environmental foundations influence the way that we behave and the way that we think, the way that we process information. So from the very beginning, conception occurs. We receive 23 chromosomes from our mom. We receive 23 chromosomes from our dad. And then in total, we have 46 chromosomes. Then from that point, in our cell nucleus, we have the nucleus, the cell body, beginning to grow. And then eventually, that nucleus will grow into chromosomes, creating our DNA. And then from that point, it makes up our genes. So we're able to have a skin tone, we're able to have eye color, hair texture, height, body structure, even personality traits. So all of that it is occurring as this process of conception is happening. So let's look at how our genes work. So we have dominant genes, recessive genes, and polygenetic traits. I didn't really focus specifically on polygenetic traits per se, but I do want you to look at the differences between dominant genes and your recessive genes. So for your dominant genes, you know that this is a gene that you would inherit that is most dominant from one of your parents. So for an example, if your mom has brown eyes and your dad has green eyes, if you are born with green eyes, then your dad with the green eyes, the dominant gene, was profound, and it was shown through or illustrated through you once you were born, or even in the makeup as you were in utero. Gene, that one specific trait that is expressed from your one of your parents. So then you have your recessive genes, which are a little bit different. This particular gene is expressed when you have two recessive genes, one from your mom and one from your dad. But then from those two have to connect in order for you to receive that particular trait. So for example, if your mom has brown hair and your dad has black hair, and then when you receive red hair, then your mom has the recessive gene of red hair, and your dad also has the recessive gene of red hair. So then somewhere down the line of heritage, someone in your family had that gene. Both of your parents, somewhere down the line, had that gene of red hair. And even though your parents don't have red hair, you have red hair. So that's how recessive genes, one of the ways that recessive genes show or express themselves in a human being. So then when you look at your polygenetic traits, these traits are pretty much more affected by environmental, even social factors. This could be personality traits. This could also be your height, your skin tone. So even if you're African American, Caucasian, Asian, Indian, Native American, whatever your ethnicity is, there may be different shades there where You may be a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, reddish tones, height, how tall you are. Those particular traits are called polygenetic traits. So those differences primarily between dominant genes and recessive genes for your exam. So your textbook looks at different studies. It talks about the twin studies. It also talks about adoption studies, which we will look at in just a minute. But your twin studies pretty much looked at how identical twins versus fraternal twins share their genes and their makeup, and how even when they're raised in the same environment, there could be some differences presented. However, in your identical twins, they share 100% the same gene pool. Even though they share that gene pool, they could possibly have different polygenetic traits, such as their personality, but they would be far more alike, which you have the monozygotic makeup. And then for the fraternal, you have the dizygotic makeup, which is half of that gene pool. But your environment can still definitely contribute to the inheritance of how you will behave, the way that you will think in certain situations, your personality type, because I'm sure you all have been around twins before, and even though they look spitting image, for an example, identical twins, they could have different personality traits, but they may tend to be far more alike than, say, your fraternal twins in nature. So then your textbook also talks about another study regarding heritability, as far as how we inherit certain traits from our relatives, those of which we are closest to, far more different than maybe relatives that we are not close in proximity with. However, we may have parents or grandparents who we share that genetic makeup, and we may exhibit traits or even personality traits or just like those parents or grandparents, even though they're not necessarily around us in our environment, as that's a part of our genetic makeup. So here's the adoption study and what that looks and what this looks like. And so in this particular study, it just talks about how even with adoption, even though you may not have the same genetic makeup, there are environmental factors that may play a role in the way that you are, as well as your genetic factors. So the first one, it says if adopted children are more like their biological parents, then you see those genetic factors having a greater influence on the way that they behave or their personality traits. I could give myself as an example. Although I was not raised with my mother, there were a lot of things once I met her that we shared, or that were very similar, even though she was not in my environment, or nor was I in her environment for pretty much my entire life as far as growing up was concerned. So those were genetic factors playing a major part. Whereas environmental factors, you may see some people who were adopted or raised by friends or family friends or something like that, and they're not around their genetic or their biological parents. They still may have some sort of influence. Those parents will have an influence on those particular children because of the environmental factors. So they may exhibit traits in their personality that are very much like their adoptive parents, even though there's no genetic influence present. So as we're talking, we find that both our makeup as well as our environment play a major part in the way that we behave and also the way that we think. So in evolutionary psychology, we kind of touched on this in chapter 1 and looked at what Charles Darwin was kind of coming up with as far as adapting, survival of the fittest, and how we cope and survive in our particular environment and continue to reproduce. So when you look at evolutionary psychology, it suggests that behavioral commonalities among human populations, from eating to fighting with our enemies, emerge and remain in human populations because they help our ancestors survive. So that even goes back to how if you have two individuals in the same, maybe they're the last two people left on the earth, eventually somebody is going to decide, hey, I'm fighting, I'm going to survive this thing. I think about the some of these television shows that they have out there, where you go out and into the wilderness and you have to survive. And even if that means, killing or the next person in order to survive, that's what we do in order to survive. So sort of when you think of it like an animalistic a perspective of surviving and not becoming extinct, and definitely we as humans have that trait as far as the ability to survive. So natural selection, and basically talking about adapting to our environment so we can stay alive, we continue to reproduce. So that's just kind of recapping what we looked at in chapter 1. So now that we are kind of looking at how the makeup of our genes occur, let's look at a little bit of the brain. And this particular chapter really goes in depth about our central nervous system. It's going to look at the way that our neurons function, what is a neuron. So let's kind of look at that. So the building blocks of the brain. You have your neuron and you have your glial cell. I want you all to be able to identify your neuron and your glial cell. So our neuron, let's look at that. I want you all to process what exactly is the purpose of your neuron. If you, for example, go and touch a hot stove, you put your hand on the stove and your body reacts, you feel the burn, you remove your hand, then you know that your neurons are working very well, okay? So our neuron basically transmits information throughout our body, okay? Throughout our central nervous system, to the other parts of our brain, spinal cord. Our brain is going to signal and tell us, hey, or from that point, for a neuron to our brain, sending and transmitting messages back and forth, letting us know that maybe something is wrong or even that something feels good. So it's receiving and transmitting information throughout our body. So then your glial cell is like the protector of your neuron, providing nutrients and support for your neuron. And it also helps to provide that communication or that transmission of information within your nervous system in order to make sure that your neurons are functioning at their highest capacity. To, if you will, kind of like the food or the protection of your neuron. So for your exam, I want you to be familiar with the parts of the neuron and how that works. So looking at how your neurons actually communicate within your body. So this picture shows you, an example of what your neuron looks like, and then what each particular portion of your neuron functions. So let's look at the first one. You have your dendrites. Your dendrites receive the information from your other cell, while the actual cell body receives the information from the dendrites. So then once your cell body receives the information from your dendrites, that is then stimulated over and passed to your axon. So once the axon receives it, it carries that information to other body cells. Um, and then your mind leaf sheath says we have to hurry up and get to the brain to let the brain know, hey, we need to move our hand before we completely burn our hand off, right? So the myelin sheath covers the axon and insulates it, protecting it, if you will, and it speeds up that neural impulse to get to the brain and say, hey, we got to move our hand really quickly, okay? And then you have the terminal buttons, of which releases those chemicals called neurotransmitters, kind of like what you feel saying, hey, move your hand quick, or kind of like that. I don't know how you would really explain it, but you know that feeling of when you feel a shock of being burned or hot water or something to that effect, you kind of feel the release of those chemicals that we know as neurotransmitters. So take time and listen to your lecture as much as you want and kind of focus on understanding the parts of a neuron. Think of the time that you stubbed your toe. This process of the neuron goes so quickly, thankfully, which helps to protect our body from harm, or severity, the severity of harm, if it's able to do so. So here are some neurotransmitters and how they work. When you see some of these neurotransmitters, you see that some of these are provided through drugs as well, and which is why it causes problems for people or causes addictions, different addictions, because it may either uh, um, decrease the level of neurotransmitters that we have in our body, or it may increase the levels of the neurotransmitter, which causes us to be, to hallucinate or to be in like at an increased euphoria, if you will, or even depression. So I want you all to take the time to look at these different neurotransmitters. Focus more so, if you will, on dopamine, endorphins, and serotonin. That is dopamine, endorphins, and serotonin. Those are the three that I want you to focus on. Um, excuse me, for your examination. Okay, so you have one that's more a neurotransmitter that helps with movement. It talks about with dopamine, if you have too little, if your levels of dopamine are too low, this causes a major issue as far as like your mobility, which is linked to Parkinson's disease. And it also plays a major role, like I was saying before, in addiction as well. So then you have your endorphins that play a whole lot in your sexual arousal, your appetite, your memory, your ability to learn, your blood pressure, your emotions, pain, those sorts of things. And then you also have serotonin. This helps also with your appetite, how you perceive through your senses, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, well as your emotions or your mood and such. And it talks about how if you have low levels of serotonin, this is definitely associated with what we call today as depression. So that goes along with even being exposed to sunlight, as well as getting plenty rest, eating properly, things of that nature. So your textbook talks about the differences between your hormones and your neurotransmitters. Now, your neurotransmitters are signaled through your body and your central nervous system, through you know through through your cells, neurons, your spinal cord, etc. While your hormones are more through your blood. So it talks about different things: your parathyroid, pancreas, your testes, your pineal glands, hypothalamus, which controls your pituitary gland, in your pituitary gland, thyroid, adrenal glands, and ovaries, looking at the differences in how and what this looks in males versus females and how this works, um, whether it be sexual differences between males and females. As you know, males have the testes while females have the ovaries. Um, we both have that pancreas and the adrenal glands that help function our stress levels, our sexual functioning, our kidney functioning, um, also regulating our blood sugars, which we know the illness that when the pancreas is out of control causes what we know today as diabetes, and etc. So your pituitary gland helps with hormones and growth. As we get older and we're hitting puberty and such, and the hypothalamus within the brain helps to regulate and control that pituitary gland of growth. So some of us, grow or mature biologically quicker than others, and etc. So just take time to look at this. I didn't specifically test you on every single um, portion of the endocrine system, and then the different hormones associated. However, I want you to be familiar with these terms. So the nervous system. For your test, I do want you to know the differences between your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. So your central nervous system is a part of your brain and your spinal cord alone, while your peripheral nervous system is all the nerves and neurons connecting outside of your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, so let's look at it. So you have your main nervous system. If you're looking at here at the diagram, you have your main nervous system, and this is where your brain neurons extend throughout your body. So you have your central nervous system, if you're looking at the left, where it is primarily within your spinal cord, connecting to your brain. And it helps direct mental and basic life processes, while your peripheral nervous system carries throughout your entire body and carries that information from the central nervous system and then outward to the rest of the body. So as you continue to look down at each side, you have on the left in your central nervous system, your spinal cord, and your brain, which then takes you down to the structures of your brain, and we're going to look at that in just a minute, while your peripheral nervous system looks at muscular movement, your muscle memory, our involuntary functions such as our heartbeats, our fight or flight responses to stress, mobility, our ability to be calm, and then also our body's ability to react to different stressors, of which we know as the fight or flight response. So how does the spinal reflex work? Let's look at reflexes. You will need to know what a reflex is for your next exam. A reflex is something that is automatic. It's an automatic response to stimulus. It's an innate ability. When we go to the doctor, they actually check our reflexes, and most times they use like a little wooden utensil or hammer, if you will, and they will hit your knee to check your reflexes, and you'll see it feels kind of weird, and then your leg will on its own reflex. So that would be an example of your reflex, and it is an automatic response to some particular type of stimulus. So be able to define what a reflex is. That should be relatively easy for you to process. And this kind of just goes specifically into the peripheral nervous system. We looked at that in the other on the other slide. This gives you a little bit more in-depth look at the peripheral nervous system, because this is where a lot of our sexual arousal comes. When you look at the somatic nervous system versus the autonomic nervous system, the somatic nervous system allows our muscles to convey information throughout our central nervous system. So it's a lot of our motor skills, our ability to move our arms, our legs, etc. While you're so it's providing energy, if you will. It gives you energy to function or run, play, whatever it might be. While your autonomic nervous system, it's more of a calming factor. It allows your body to calm, reduce stress. It also provides control of your basic functions such as your heartbeat, um, digestion, even your the way that your body is responding to those stressors. So we're kind of like either expending out energy in response to some sort of threat, which is your sympathetic nervous system within the autonomic system, nervous system, where you may have your parasympathetic nervous system, which calms your body and conserves energy, and allows your body to be relaxed. So take time to look at that as well. So one kind of arouses and one calms for arousal. So on this particular slide, we're going to look more in depth with the brain. I'm not necessarily going to get uh, very, very deep on this particular lesson on the brain, but we're going to look at some of the main points of the brain. Now, let's look at our different our three main areas. So you have the forebrain, which is right in the front of the brain. Okay, here, your frontal lobe, your forebrain. And then you have your midbrain, that of course is in the middle. And then you have your hindbrain, that which of course is in the back of the brain. And within these different areas of the brain, you have other um, areas that provide function, whether it be for your emotions or your sensory functioning, processing information, um, your appetite, your behavior, and all of those things. So we're going to look at that. Now, I didn't test you specifically on, like I said, getting completely in depth with the excuse me, the terminologies of each portion or each part of your brain, but let's just kind of look at it. So you have the medulla. It's a part of your hindbrain. All three of these are part of the hindbrain. And this particular part of the brain allows automatic function for your respiratory system as well as your cardiovascular system, your heart and respiration. While your pons, also part of your hindbrain structure, allows you to move, also part of your respiratory system, walking, sleeping, dreaming, all of that is a part of the function of your pons. And your cerebellum allows you to have balance, allows you to use your fine motor skills, which allows for coordination. Say, for instance, tying your shoe or or putting a button together on your shirt, and also allows you to perceive information more effectively, giving you coordination. Your midbrain also helps with coordination and movements and patterns, sleep, arousal. You'll see that every part of your brain kind of works together, and they kind of help in uh, their own ways, in the same type of areas, but possibly in different types of ways, helping you to effectively move, effectively think, the way that our sensory makeup is, the way that we process information, that we hear, that we see, that we touch, that we taste, that we smell, and etc. So your midbrain particularly is responsible for your coordination as well. And then your forebrain has a lot to do with your memory. It has a lot to do with your emotions, your arousal, such as hunger or sexual arousal, information processing, problem solving. That's all in that frontal lobe, that forebrain area, where you have your thalamus, your hypothalamus, your limbic system, and your cerebral cortex. So we're going to look at that as well. So focus on your limbic system as well as your amygdala. So in your limbic system, you have these three main systems within the system. Your limbic system, I want you to think of that as the place where your emotions live. It's the structure of your emotions, your drives, your memory as well, emotional memory. So your hypothalamus governs that drive, that gives you that drive to be hungry, to want sex, to want water, to fight, to flight, etc. And then your hippocampus helps to form and retrieve memories that are being created through those urges or through your emotions. If any one of you have watched the movie Inside Out, that shows a very nice figure of how the brain works, and even looks at how the limbic system um, works as well. And your amygdala, specifically looking at the amygdala, this is the part of your brain that what we call, typically we call that your emotion center. This holds your emotions and regulates and produces those emotions. For an example, aggression and fear. Um, and when you think of your amygdala, it's important to note that this is the part of your brain that actually grows the quickest when you're a child. So this is why children tend to have temper tantrums and they can't control, their anger, and they're very egocentristic, because their emotions are actually growing much quicker in the limbic system than their forebrain, where reasoning and conceptualizing information processing is occurring. The amygdala is actually growing much more quickly, which then in parenting and environmental factors we help to kind of balance that out as they continue to grow into their teenage years. So for your test, I want you to really hone in on the major functions of your lobes of the brain. You have your frontal lobes, you have your parietal lobes, you have your temporal lobes, and your occipital lobes. So let me go back to your frontal lobes and your parietal lobes. You need to know those four major lobes of the brain and be able to know the functions of those lobes. So you have the frontal lobe. Again, this is where your motor skills come in, your speech production come in. Be familiar with your Broca's area. Your Broca's area is the part of the brain that allows you to be able to speak effectively. Um, and the frontal lobe also allows your brain to process information, your personality type, how you display emotions, and even how your ability to memorize information. That's a part of your frontal lobe: problem solving, motor skills, speech. in the Broca's area. And then you have your parietal lobe. Your parietal lobe is more of your bodily sensations. It's your sensory area. It's the place where you understand and interpret information that you receive, and you process it through your sight, through your taste, through your touch, through your smell, etc. That is your parietal lobe. So when you think of the parietal lobe, I want you to think of senses, sensations, senses, how we interpret and receive information through our senses. Then we have the temporal lobe. You all should possibly know some of this information already, because a lot of this you hear about in high school as well. So you have your temporal lobe. This is the part of your brain that allows you to hear. Okay? So you have two temporal lobes on both sides, which allows you to hear. This is a part of what we call your auditory cortex. Excuse me. This is how you understand language. We call this the Wernicke's area. So for your not your parietal, but your frontal lobe, you have the Broca's area, which allows you to have speech development, be able to speak, and your Wernicke area allows you to be able to understand language. Okay, and it also holds some emotion control as well as memory. So then you have your occipital lobe. Your occipital lobe, as you may already know, is your visual cortex. It's responsible for your ability to see, okay, and process the information that you are seeing. So again, you also have two lobes. You see, you have two eyes, you have two lobes on both sides of your brain, the back of your brain, that allows you to be able to see. So although you may think it is just your eyes that allows you to see, hear, process information that you hear, it actually all begins in your brain. And then that information filters out through your ears, the different parts of your ears, different parts of your eyes, taste buds, etc. But essentially, all of this information starts at the brain. That is the center of your entire body working. That's the head, that's the lead of your body as we know it. Okay? So let's look at our next slide. Now, for the remainder of this chapter, if you look in your PowerPoint presentations and you go to chapter 2, there's actually an area where you can practice some of this information, prepare for the exam, test yourself. It's kind of like a brain jeopardy. And I would encourage all of you to take time and kind of just indulge in the information to make sure that you all are conceptualizing the information effectively and processing the information effectively. So that will be all for this chapter 2 that I want you to focus on for your exam. This chapter is somewhat lengthy, but of course there's going to be portions that I focused on in this lecture that I want you to utilize to prepare for your first exam. So we're going to go ahead and close this chapter 2, and I will see you in chapter 3. And if you all have any questions, feel free to contact me if you do. But I will see you guys in class on next time.